Hey everyone, Zelos here. Today I'm going to be presenting to you my Mage guide for Elden Ring as of patch 1.03. In this guide I'll be going over attribute allocation, equipment, and the standout spells that make this playstyle work so well as where to find everything. So what are the advantages of playing an intelligence-based spellcaster in Elden Ring? Well, to put it bluntly, you can absolutely melt your enemies with powerful spells to the point of making many ordinarily challenging encounters completely trivial. The difficulty with this build lies not with its application, but instead with its setup. You have a long list of items and spells you'll need to acquire that span from early to late game areas. So, let's dive right in. Just a heads up, I started my mage as an astrologer, but prisoner is a fine choice too. Starting off, let's take a look at the attribute spread I'm currently working with. Just a quick note, this build stops at 150, which is a slightly higher stopping point than previous FromSoft titles, due to the higher soft caps for attributes in Elden Ring. Intelligence is going to be our primary scaling attribute and will take priority over everything else. If you plan on casting the best sorceries, you're going to want to get your intelligence to at least 68, but I recommend 80 because scaling is still quite strong for the extra levels. Our next most important attribute is going to be Vigor, which determines our health points. You'll find most players aim for 60, but I opted to be more of a glass cannon and stopped at 47. This means that we are especially susceptible in PvP situations given the current bleed meta, and can easily be one-shot if we're not careful. This issue is further compounded by a certain talisman that I'll be speaking about a bit later. The last attribute we want is going to be Mind, which determines our overall FP pool. With this stat, I think that anything above 30 is going to be sufficient for aggressive casting. I have mine parked at 35. As far as strength and dexterity, I suggest you get them to the minimum requirements for the weapon or weapons you'll be using, but no further. 16 strength and 18 dexterity will allow you to use all three weapons that I'll be suggesting. The reason for this is that the weapons that I will be suggesting scale great off of intelligence and don't really need the extra AR contribution from these physical stats. Endurance is probably our least important stat. I chose to keep it at a low 17 as it puts me right at medium load when I'm fully equipped. Something to consider is that these stats are malleable. You don't have to go with the exact setup I have here, do what works for you. However, for this build to really function as intended, you're going to want to at least get your intelligence to 68, as I said before. I usually run Godric's Great Rune because plus 5 in every attribute boosts everything about your character, even if the margin is minor. Moving on from attributes, let's get into gear. Starting with the caster's most important piece of equipment, their casting medium or catalyst. For the majority of our spellcasting, we'll be going with the Carrion Regal Scepter, which to my knowledge is the highest intelligence scaling staff in the game that does not come with detrimental side effects. You can get this item from Renala's Remembrance after clearing the Raya Lucaria Academy in Liurnia. Another catalyst of note that you'll want in your arsenal is Lusat's Glintstone Staff, which has even higher intelligence scaling than the Carrion Regal Scepter, but at the cost of 50% more FP used per spell. This trade-off makes Lusat's staff inefficient for most situations, but there is one specific instance where this is a superior choice, which we'll be getting into when we talk a bit more about the Wondrous Physick flask. You can find Lusat's staff in Caelid within Celia Town of Sorcery. You'll need to defeat the duo boss encounter within Celia to claim the staff. When you're first starting off with this build, you might also want to grab the Meteorite Staff, which can be a good placeholder until you get the Carrion Regal Scepter. This staff not only has great intelligence scaling, but also boosts the damage of gravity spells, which are especially good early on. It's a great early game choice, but drops off heavily later on due to the fact that it cannot be upgraded at all. You can find the Meteorite Staff in Caelid, specifically at the Streets of Sage Ruins. Alright, let's talk weapons, all of which should I present to you scale very well off of intelligence. There's a katana-shaped elephant in the room that should be addressed here, and its name is Moonveil. One of the best weapons in the game, the Moonveil Katana is 100% a meta weapon at the time of recording this guide. What does that mean? It means you should get it and absolutely use it in PvE. In PvP, you may get a little hate when wielding it due to its incredible damage and lightning fast Ashes of War. Not to mention its innate bleed buildup. If that stigma doesn't bother you, then by all means go for it. At this point, this weapon is so common in PvP that most decent players know how to deal with it by now. The weapon does split physical magic damage, and as mentioned before, has built-in bleed. The Ashes of War, called Transient Moonlight, puts you in a sheathed stance where the R1 triggers a horizontal wave of energy, great for groups or role-catching players, while the R2 unleashes a vertical slice charged with magic energy that travels for quite a distance. For best results, you'll want to try and hit your target with the blade when performing these attacks. You'll need at least 18 dexterity and 12 strength to use Moonveil, and it can be found after defeating the Magma Worm in Gale Tunnel, which is in Caelid. Another great choice for this build is a Dark Moon Greatsword, an iconic weapon that has made an appearance in many FromSoft titles. This greatsword does split physical magic damage and has innate frost buildup. Its Ashes of War, called Moonlight Greatsword, is a self-buff that increases the weapon's AR and activates its projectile attacks. Once buffed, you can produce waves of moonlight at no FP cost by using heavy attacks with R2. Interestingly, the projectile attacks count as weapon skills, so they benefit from the Shard of Alexander talisman. Much like the Moonveil, you'll see the most damage if you hit the target with the actual blade when using the projectile feature. The weapon requires 16 strength and 11 dexterity to use, and can be found after completing the very long, but very cool questline for Ranni the Witch. The last weapon I'll be mentioning is the Wing of Estelle. A curved sword with some interesting properties. If used correctly, it can continuously stagger enemies, doing massive damage in the process. Like the Dark Moon Greatsword, this weapon has a projectile functionality that doesn't cost FP, but the icing on the cake here is that you don't need to activate the projectiles with a self buff. Instead, they are always available to you through your heavy attacks. Since this is a curved sword, you can even cancel the heavy attacks by dodging out of them, giving you a good amount of options if you realize that you've made the wrong move. Another fantastic feature of this weapon is the Ashes of War, called Nebula, which summons a spread of stars that explode after a slight delay. This attack is the one that does massive poise damage, and works nicely in conjunction with the Shard of Alexander, but even without it, is quite deadly. In my opinion, the only thing Moonveil has on the Wing of Estelle is that built-in bleed functionality. Otherwise, I would consider this a superior weapon for a caster. Obviously, it's going to be doing a split magic physical damage, just like the other weapons previously listed. You're going to need 17 dexterity to wield this weapon, and it can be found in a chest within the Ul Palace ruins, which is close to the Einsel River Grace. That's underground. If you haven't gotten that far, then you will, naturally, just by progressing Ranni the Witch's quests. So that about covers my armament suggestions. Keep in mind all items listed require somber smithing stones to upgrade. Now, let's move on to talismans. Our first category of talismans will focus on increasing the power of our sorceries directly. Starting with the Graven School talisman, which boosts sorceries by 4%. It can be found in the Raya Lucaria Academy near the debate parlor, behind an illusionary wall, then further hidden in a back room with a massive crystal. The direct upgrade to the previous talisman is the Graven Mass talisman, which boosts sorceries by 8% and can stack with its lesser version for a total of 12%. This item is found in a later area called the Consecrated Snowfields, in a tower dubbed Albinaric's Rise. You'll have to solve a puzzle to break the tower's seal, which involves you pitting the imps located around the tower against each other by means of a bewitching branch or by using the fanged imp ashes. The third talisman is called the Magic Scorpion Charm, and unlike the previous two, it doesn't just increase sorcery damage, but magic damage in general by 12%, which includes all of the weapons I've listed previously since they do magic damage. The trade-off here is that wearing the talisman will incur roughly 10% more physical damage to your character. The boost to magic damage can stack with the previously mentioned talismans for a whopping 24% boost to magic damage based sorceries. You can find this item by completing a large portion of Celavis's questline, which must be done before giving Ronnie the item she requests from Nokron, the Eternal City. I consider the three talismans mentioned so far to be pretty crucial to the build, but use your own discretion when deciding if the Magic Scorpion charm makes sense for the way that you're playing your character, because it makes our already fragile mage even more susceptible to incoming damage. Next up we have the Radigan Icon, a talisman which boosts your casting speed by giving you 30 virtual dexterity. I find this talisman more useful in PvP than PvE. It can be found in the upper section of the debate parlor, which can be accessed after defeating the boss. Another great choice is the Stargazer Heirloom. This one gives you an extra 5 intelligence, which not only increases our sorcery damage, but our weapons as well, since they scale with intelligence. You can find this talisman at the top of the Divine Tower of Liurnia. Some honorable mentions are the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, which restores FP when performing critical attacks, the Ancestral Spirit Horn, which restores FP when you kill enemies, and the Shard of Alexander, which boosts Ashes of War damage. As far as armor goes, that's more or less a personal decision. I'd say simply go with what looks good to you. However, there are some pieces that boost certain spells or stats, although I find their effects to be relatively negligible. The Twin Sage Glintstone Crown stands out as an interesting choice since it boosts your intelligence by 6, as long as you don't mind the 9% hit to health and stamina, as well as looking like a mutant Burger King. Another one to mention is the Queen's Crescent Crown, which adds 3 intelligence with no detrimental effects except that you look like a complete idiot. My personal choice is the Navy Hood, as it boosts mine by 1, has no downsides, and also looks pretty slick. There are quite a few other choices that boost spell types, such as the Snow Witch, Spell Sword, Primeval, Lusat, and Rogier sets, to name a few. For me, though, I'm a slave to conservative fashion souls and generally avoid using these more strange and gaudy armors. With gear out of the way, let's talk flasks, specifically your flask of Wondrous Physick. We're going to want to get 2 very special tiers for our custom flask that will give us a massive trump card should we want to simply delete a foe or at least melt off a chunk of their health bar. The first tier we need is called the Magic Shrouding Cracked tier. This nifty tier will boost our magic damage by 20% in PvE and 15% in PvP, lasting a very generous 3 minutes. Since it boosts straight up magic damage, it will not only impact our sorceries but our weapons as well. You can find this tier by defeating the Erdtree Avatar in Northeast Liurnia under the Minor Erdtree. The other tier is a devious thing called the Cerulean Hidden tier. What it does is for roughly 15 seconds you can cast spells without consuming FP. This is incredibly powerful and synergizes very well with a few spells and Lusat's Glintstone Staff. I'll get into how to make all of this work a bit later in the video, but just keep in mind that you absolutely want to grab this tier. You can find it by defeating the Ulcerated Tree Spirit in Mount Gelmir, just east of the Road of Iniquity Grace. Alright, that was a lot, but there's still a bit to cover, namely the spells you'll want to be using. There are 4 legendary sorceries out there in the lands between, and they're all worth getting. The most important of the 4 when it comes to PvE is certainly Comet Azure. It's an incredibly powerful spell that fires out a comet, which in practice behaves more like a massive beam attack that can be continually casted for your entire FP bar if desired. Once you do cast Comet Azure, you're going to be dedicated to that cast, as you cannot redirect the beam or move your character when you are actually in the animation, so you're going to have to look for a good opportunity if the enemy is already engaged with you to cast the spell. When you do manage to connect with it, you will do catastrophic damage to the target. You can even hit multiple targets if they're lined up. In PvP, Comet Azure is best used as a sneak attack against distracted opponents. Otherwise, it's a relatively useless spell in a stand-up fight due to its obvious telegraphing and lack of tracking. Keep in mind that Comet Azure takes up 3 sorcery slots. You can find the spell with the one who created it, Primeval Sorcerer Azure. He can be found in the Hermit Village on Mount Gelmir, right next to a grace behind a demi-human mini-boss. Simply interact with the Silent Sorcerer to acquire the spell. By acquiring it and showing Sorceress Selen your discovery, she'll direct you to the next spell on our list. Stars of Ruin is a legendary sorcery that is especially menacing in PvP. This spell fires 12 shooting stars that hone in on your target with relentless accuracy and can even be charged for additional power at the cost of a slightly longer casting time. When used alone or in multi-spell mix-ups, Stars of Ruin seems to always at least hit an evading target once, but usually much more than that. The only way it can be fully dodged seems to be with the Bloodhound Step Ashes of War. The sheer pressure this spell puts on another player can immediately break their strategy and cause them to panic. All the while they're being damaged and staggered by the barrage of shooting stars. You can find the Stars of Ruin after Selen gives you the Celian Sealbreaker, after showing her that you found Comet Azor. Go to the Celia Hideaway in Caelid. Deep inside you'll find a seal that you can break now. Master Lusat will be behind the seal, and interacting with him will grant you the spell. Ranni's Dark Moon is another legendary sorcery. Being the superior version of Rena's Full Moon, this spell not only hits like a truck with its homing moon projectile, but also reduces the target's magic negation by 10%. In addition, it comes with a large amount of frost buildup, and when an enemy is frostbitten, they take an additional 20% hit to damage negation. This makes the Dark Moon a fantastic opener in boss fights to soften up the target for other sorceries. Keep in mind though, the casting animation is long and you can easily be broken out of it. In PvP, it's best to use this on off-guard opponents, but there are times when people get tripped up by its accelerating speed and get simply demolished. To find this spell, you'll have to have gotten pretty far in Ranni's quest, to the point where you're teleported to the Moonlight Altar. On that plateau, there's a sealed tower called Chelona's Rise. You're going to want to find that, and to break the seal, you start by reading the plaque in front of the tower. Then go find and kill 3 spectral turtles on the plateau. The turtles portion has been known to be a bit buggy, so you might want to look at this one online, maybe on the Fextra Life wiki, for some written instructions or maybe testimonials through the comments. This 2-slot spell can be found at the top of the tower once you've broken the seal, and its steep 68 intelligence requirement is why I said that you want to have that as your minimum attribute. The last of the legendary sorceries, Bounding Rain of Stars, is an interesting area of denial spell. It creates starry clouds above the casting point that release a downpour of magic onto any enemies unfortunate enough to be caught underneath. To be honest, this spell looks better than it performs, but that's not to say that it doesn't have its uses. It excels at shredding packs of minor to medium threat enemies, and if you can keep a boss still in it, it can do a significant amount of damage while not tying you down like a Comet Azure cast would. In PvP, it can work well in holding back aggressive opponents, giving you more room to cast other spells from within the falling stars. The downsides are that it doesn't cause staggering. Subsequent cast makes the previous cloud dissipate, so you can't stack them, and it only forms from the point where you casted it. I don't consider this 2-slot spell essential, but a more flashy sorcery that I use when the mood strikes. You'll find this spell only after crossing an invisible bridge in the mountaintop of the Giants region. The bridge leads up to Heretical Rise, where you'll find the spell inside of a chest. That does it for the named legendary sorceries, but don't let that title fool you. There are plenty of other sorceries worth your spell slots that don't have the honor of being considered a legendary sorcery. Our first non-legendary sorcery is Comet. Just plain old Comet. Not to be mistaken with Comet Azure. They are 2 very different spells. This is the most powerful version of Glintstone Pebble, and when you have the FP pool to support it, it becomes a pretty useful spell with respectable damage. Although it's still not as FP efficient as its sister spells, it is efficiently bursty, and just enough to justify in boss fights and PvP situations. You can fire it in succession as well as charge cast for about a 20% increase in the damage. Comet also has a piercing quality to it, able to hit multiple targets when lined up, and the projectile travels slightly further than other spells like it. It's kind of a harken back to the Crystal Soul Spear of the Dark Souls series. You can find this spell just before the debate parlor in Raya Lucaria Academy, behind an illusionary wall to the right when exiting the boss room. Glintstone Icecrag is our next sorcery. Casting it sends out a projectile of icy glintstone that does decent damage and adds what seems to be about 80 frostbite buildup per shot. Its low FP cost is a nice option for keeping an enemy frostbitten, especially if you just fired off Ronnie's Dark Moon but the status effect failed to proc. The issue with this spell is that it has pretty slow speed, its range is lacking, and its tracking isn't really there when you need it, which they aren't all necessarily horrible qualities, but they are comparatively worse than the other glintstone projectile spells. The obvious reason to run this sorcery is for the frostbite, but I suggest you keep it to solely PvE scenarios. You can purchase the spell from Celavis at his tower near Ronnie's Rise in Liurnia. You'll have to have made a little progress in both Ronnie's and his quest line to access his wares. Alternatively, if he's dead, simply hand over his bearing to the Twin Maiden Husk back at the Round Table Hold. Now we come to Meteorite of Estelle, a spell that summons an apocalyptic amount of meteors from the cosmos that come crashing down on your enemies for both magical and physical damage, not to mention these meteors can cause heavy stagger. Like Comet Azure, this can be casted until your bar runs out. Ordinarily, the spell is a bit too random in how it hits to justify the massive FP cost and taking of 3 slots. Even if used just once, it's rather inefficient. However, there is a great use for it when we combine it with our Wondrous Physick, which I'll be touching on soon. You can acquire the spell after defeating the boss of Yellach Tunnel in the Consecrated Snowfields. Adula's Moonblade is a fantastic sorcery that outclasses the Carrion Greatsword by a long shot. This spell summons a large icy blade that when swung releases a wave of frost. Hitting with both the blade and projectile will maximize damage. You can chain swings together for a sequence of attacks with alternating directions. Unsurprisingly, the spell also builds up the frostbite status on targets about 90 on a hit. You pretty much always want to have this in both PvE and PvP scenarios, as the damage and wide range can turn the tide of a fight rather quickly. You'll find this spell after defeating the dragon, who lingers around the Cathedral of Manus Celis, a structure only reachable after progressing Ronnie's quest line to the Moonlight Altar. The next sorcery functions as a counter spell of sorts. It's called Eternal Darkness. Casting it creates a black hole that lasts about 10 seconds and sucks up many projectile-based spells, not including Comet Azure or either Full Moon Sorcery. And it's important to note, this will not suck up your spells, only incoming spells from enemy entities. This spell has amazing utility when dealing with casters both in PvE and PvP. I find this a superior choice to the Carrion Retaliation spell, because you don't have to actively cast it to benefit from its effects. You simply use it once and then fire away at your opponent in your newly created area of denial. The black hole even acts to obscure you partially, which can be used to catch opponents off guard. It can be found in Caelid, south of the Church of the Plague, in a cell on the ground floor of a derelict tower. Terra Magica is a must-have buff for any caster doing magic damage. This spell places a sigil on the ground underneath the caster that boosts all magic damage by a staggering 35% for 30 seconds. This means magic damage weapons get a big boost as well. You do need to stay inside of the sigil to keep the buff going, although you can hang on to its effect for about 1.5 seconds after stepping outside of the sigil, which is handy if you have to dodge something and then want to react with a fast cast right back at your target. This sorcery buff also stacks with the magic shrouding crack tier and is integral to our ultimate goal with our Wondrous Flask. You'll find this spell after the boss room in the Academy Crystal Cave in Liurnia. There are some other sorceries that are fantastic for mix-ups, a strategy you'll want to implement in PvP. It involves casting a myriad of projectile spells that all have different timings and speeds to overwhelm your opponent. What comes to mind is Carrion Phalanx, basically the homing soul mass of Elden Ring. Usually the first spell you cast in a sequence. Next you can cast 3 helpings of magic Glintblade, which creates a portal that fires delayed projectiles depending on how long you charge the spell. While those 2 spells are brewing, you can fire 1 to 3 barrages of Stars of Ruin. Just those 3 spells cast in succession can trip up most opponents if not kill them outright. If they manage to get close to you, you can switch to Adula's Moonblade or start using your weapon. You can even throw in an ambush shard or 2, a spell that creates a projectile behind your enemy, which is great to cast against shield users who like the turtle. A specific build that this mix-up strategy absolutely does not work against is anyone running the Bloodhound Step Ashes. You'll get Carrion Phalanx from Celavis and Magic Glintblade from either Mariel at the Church of Vows or by starting as the Prisoner class. Ambush Shard can be found on the Weeping Peninsula within the Witchbane Ruins. Final mentions go to some melee range spells such as Carrion Slicer, a spell that summons a swift magic blade that can be spammed like a regular weapon for a very low FP cost. It even has a backstep, rolling, and sprinting attack animation and does purely magic damage. Gavel of Haima can be pretty clutch too, since the magic hammer you summon has an AoE feature built into it. You can swing this thing twice in succession, just keep in mind that you can be easily interrupted out of the cast. So I don't recommend trading with players running a higher poise build or using heavy weapons. Carrion Slicer can be purchased from Sorceress Selen in Limgrave, while Gavel of Haima can be found at the converted Fringe Tower in Liurnia, after performing the erudition gesture at the statue while wearing one of the glintstone crowns. That covers the sorceries of note in my build. This isn't to say that there aren't any other great sorceries out there. There are a ton of them. Sorceries are really what you make of them. They're highly situational. There's definitely some comparatively better and worse sorceries, but I covered for what I consider to be the most important sorceries in our kit. A quick note about Glintstone spell efficiency. Nothing will ever be more FP efficient than just using Glintstone Pebble, as it scales quite well, especially at high intelligence. Sometimes though, you just want more damage and faster. That's why I spoke about using Comet. It's still worth using Pebble or even Comet Shard when just killing minor enemies in the open world. Maybe even in a very prolonged boss fight, it can be considered a better utility than Comet itself. Rock Sling is also a solid option if your goal is to stagger. It also has superior tracking when compared to any of the Glintstone projectiles. Now that we have our whole kit, let's talk about what we should be doing with our Wondrous Physick flask. Once you have the combination of tiers that I suggested, your setup is going to go a little bit like this. You're going to walk into a boss encounter, and the first thing you're going to want to do is cast Ranni's Dark Moon. You can do this with Terra Magica down or not. It's really not going to make a huge difference. The main goal here is to get that magic negation debuff on the enemy, maybe even proc some Frostbite. If the Frostbite doesn't proc in one shot and you're really set on getting it, follow up with some Glintstone Ice Crags. After that, you're going to certainly want to cast Terra Magica, switch to Lusat's Staff, chug your flask of Wondrous Physick, and then cast either Comet Azor or Meteorite of Estelle, and hold down that casting button until you're totally out of FP or until the target moved out of the cast. This will effectively let you cast either of these spells for over 15 seconds while being supercharged by both Terra Magica and the tier that buffs magic damage. If you can connect with your target on a Comet Azor while utilizing this method and keep them pinned down, you can literally one-shot certain demigods. This is your ultimate weapon in boss fights and should only be utilized either at the very start of a fight if your target is slow to get started, or when you find a moment to punish the boss after a long string of attack combinations. Meteorite of Estelle can be a stand-in for Comet Azor here when you're dealing with large targets, like dragons. or for farming runes. Even if you forgot to switch to Lusat's Staff, which admittedly I often do, this all-out attack will still be devastating to whoever you hit. If you hadn't made the connection, the reason we're switching to Lusat's Staff here is because it normally costs 50% more FP to cast with Lusat's Staff, but that's ignored if there's no FP cost for the first 15 seconds. So we really do benefit from that higher intelligence scaling that's implicit with the staff. So that's pretty much it. With this massive toolkit at your disposal, the way you play Elden Ring will change substantially. For better or worse, that's for you to decide, but at the end of the day, there's no denying the power of sorceries. I hope you guys found this guide helpful. If you did, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. It would be greatly appreciated. If this video gains any traction, I'll be releasing more like it for my other builds. Thanks for making it this far. This has been Zelos. Until next time.